Welcome to episode 6 of Notes from the North. This is our second off-season podcast. Today we had a guest, Casey. We recorded this on Friday. Casey is from Weekly Spiral, so we'll throw it over to the interview now.
Welcome to Notes from the North with Kyle and Sam.
We'd like to welcome a new guest to the show, Casey. Casey's from Weekly Spiral, and Casey, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and who you are and what you're working on?
Yeah, sure. I've been coaching high school football for 6 years now, or this would have been my sixth season, working on the offensive side of the ball, coaching quarterbacks, and I'm the offensive coordinator over in Tamalpais in California, across the bay from San Francisco. And so sort of some West Coast influences. I see Kyle Shanahan a lot. I see Sean McVay a lot and have implemented that kind of stuff in my offense. But my specialty is receivers and quarterbacks. And Weekly Spiral is sort of doing a little bit more in-depth breakdowns on scheme that's going on in the NFL and using video content to illustrate that on the YouTube page. And doing some written breakdowns using GIFs and diagrams. And so it's easier for people to approach the X's and O's and understand sort of what's going on, the big trends, who's doing well, why they're doing well. Is this quarterback's mechanics struggling like Carson Wentz was early in the year, had some issues. And so if you want to check out some trends that are going on in the NFL, how players are performing, why they're doing well, why they're doing poorly, that's sort of what we do at the Weekly Spiral at weeklyspiral.com.
Really neat. So how long have you been going with your site, and what kind of, feedback have you gotten? Give us a little bit of that history for weeklyspiral.com.
Sure. It's relatively new. So about a year it's been up, and the video content has been even more recent than that, probably the last 9 months or so for this football season and going into last summer. And a lot of positive response and encouraging stuff as far as this is, illustrated in a way that I hadn't necessarily seen before. It's for me, at least when I'm learning, it's a lot easier for me to visualize, see the film and hear someone talk about it than just see the diagram on the whiteboard and not understand this guy is, aligned in a one technique, but I don't necessarily visualize that as well as when I I'm seeing the film and seeing how he's attacking that center or is shading and how his body is aligned and how he's reacting to what the lineman is doing. Seeing it written out is great and useful. And there's a lot of books that write it out, and I've read a lot of them, and they can be a little bit dry and difficult for me to visualize. So seeing that film for me is the most helpful, and seeing it live and seeing it happen. So I figured I would try to bring that to people and offer that so that they can they can see it and understand at a deeper level, so that you can then translate it when you're watching football now and live. You can say, oh, this guy is aligned in a one technique. That means X, Y, Z for the offense. They need to run away or run to that, or they need to double team them or whatever. I saw the video or the diagram that, this is why the team is doing that. So on.
That's really neat. Yeah, that's really neat. And it seems like football, I think, can, especially maybe if you didn't play, it can be an intimidating sport in that it has its own distinct vocabulary. And it's just such a technical, sometimes complex sport. So I think that having sites that can, like you say, break it down, and not just break it down in some sort of dry, kind of way, but show you kind of really what's going on, and not just, but show you the NFL and that kind of thing. It's really, really neat. This is yourself, and then you have a team. You have other writers that contribute to this as well.
Yeah, we have a couple other writers, and one of them I went to graduate school with, getting my master's in sport management, and he sort of specializes in the draft and does some draft breakdowns and is a big college football guy. And so he's helped me learn a lot, and I've gotten more into college football so that I can talk with him and keep tabs on all the prospects and stuff. I've slowly gotten more and more into college football, but this year I've sort of taken more note and watched what games were available early on. And then as the conferences and the leagues started to boot up, the Big 12 and Pac-12 a little bit, and all those games started paying more attention to those guys. And I think this is a very unique year to evaluate guys because people are opting out. They're playing different levels of competition. So I would not want to be a GM this year, especially if I'm a new GM trying to evaluate guys that, maybe haven't played for a year or whatever it may be, or maybe their quarterback opted out or didn't play, or, all sorts of things are going on. There's not going to be a combine, so you got to rely on pro days. It's kind of a mess, but if you're a good GM and you have a good scouting department, this is where you can sort of separate yourself for the next couple of years, I think.
Right. That's a good point. And I mean, I will say we'll say this at the end as well, but for folks who are listening, definitely hop over to Weekly Spiral. It is a really neat site and there's a lot to be learned over there. So by all means, especially if you want to understand the game a little bit better, it's worth your time. Sam, what do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. I was curious if there's like a real passion that you have, a real area. You're saying you're getting into the college football ranks. I know you say that you focus on the receivers and the quarterback end of stuff in terms of your coaching, but yeah, just curious if there's anything that you would say is a real passion for you in terms of talking football, watching football. Kind of what's your lens as you watch and digest?
Yeah, I want to throw that ball, man. I want to see those big plays. I want to see the explosive plays. I want to see the catches and the yards after the catch and the last couple of years, especially, I've gotten more and more into the run scheme and setting things up off of play action and being more diverse with motions and shifts and formations to create angles and ideal blocking situations for your linemen to open things up. And there's some really simple ways that you can do within the structure of, really any offense. Like every offense has a jet motion or a cross motion or a shift or whatever. And seeing coaches that do that to open things up for their players is really interesting to me. And then how they sort of build and stack those plays to build to, a passing concept or, a misdirection that breaks your tendency and attacks the defense, and how they're reacting. That sort of chess match within the game is really interesting for me to see. And sometimes it's very hard to see live, and you got to go back and look at the film and see how people are reacting. But when it clicks and you see it, it's really cool for me to see.
Very cool. Very cool. Cool. Well, we'll transition into our second down here, and as you're talking about seeing quarterbacks throw the ball, we want to talk about Kirk Cousins and that. And so I know Kyle prepped you a little bit in terms of talking about him. And I guess for us, the biggest question, or one of the overarching questions, is as you kind of digested and seen the Vikings, what's your opinion on Kirk Cousins as a QB?
Yeah, I know he's a bit of a divisive guy to the NFL as a whole, and probably a lot of Vikings fans as well.
Yeah.
As a pure thrower, I think he's very, very good. He's incredibly accurate. He's dealt with a pretty bad offensive line for a number of years, especially on the interior. That being considered, the Vikings are still a very proficient offense. They're 8th best by DVOA, 6th in rushing, 11th in passing. And to be able to mask the problems up front, I think is an admirable thing. Not a lot of quarterbacks are going to be able to do that. You don't think of Kirk Cousins as being the super mobile, athletic guy like a Russell Wilson that can sort of make up for a bad offensive line. But Cousins is doing that, and he can manipulate the pocket pretty well. He can move. He's not going to take off and get chunks of yardage, but he can make those subtle moves, sort of like a Tom Brady or the more statuesque guys, where he understands where the rush is coming and he can sort of slide and move up and keep his eyes downfield. So I was impressed with that. I think mechanically his base is pretty solid. He has some disfluencies and issues sort of in his drop, but they don't affect his accuracy a ton. I think where people can start having issues with him is some of his decision making. And what stood out to me is there's not a lot of anticipation throws for him. And it's okay to be a see it throw it guy, especially when you have an arm like Kirk Cousins and you can, he's open. I can get it there right now. I can get it there on the spot and hit him right in the face and he can run afterwards. That's fantastic. But I think the lack of anticipation throws sort of puts a ceiling on your capabilities as a quarterback. It doesn't mean you can't win with them, but you're talking about like throwing an out route with anticipation when, you see that the coverage is not there. They're not going to be able to cover it. You've turned the corner's hips and you throw it before the receiver has broken, or towards the middle of the field if they're running a dig towards the interior hard in. That same sort of concept. There's no underneath defender. The safety is occupied by a deep post, whatever. I can throw it right now because he's beaten his guy. He's gotten inside leverage. And I didn't see a ton of those throws. He threw a couple to Thielen, and maybe it's just, he's working with Justin Jefferson, the rookie, and there's not a whole lot behind those two guys. And it may develop. It may shift now as the Vikings are going to have a new offensive coordinator with Kubiak retiring, and that may change things. But that's my first initial impression on sort of what he brings to the table. I'm curious what your guys' opinion on him is, because I'm sure even in the fan base, there's guys that are, Kirk Cousins stands and like he's the guy and he's going to get it done, and there's guys like, man, he ain't it.
Yeah. Go ahead, Sam.
I was just going to say, you just described exactly what I think, but like not able to process. Like that was so well done. Like I see everything that you're saying. It's like, yes, that's it. That's where it is. But just articulated in a way better way than I was able to. So that's fascinating. But Kyle's a super fan, so I'm intrigued to hear. I know I've heard his points on Cousins before, but yeah, what he would say in response to that.
Yeah, I think like I agree with what Casey's saying. The issue with Cousins has never been physical talent or lack thereof, right? Like I hear what you're saying in terms of like Russell Wilson, or like he's not Lamar Jackson. That's certainly true, but he's got some sneaky athleticism, and he I think has done better this year in just like that Brady wiggle in the pocket of just like the subtle shifts and movements to try and just give yourself an extra half moment. And like you're saying, that his arm talent is actually really good. I mean, he isn't Patrick Mahomes, but who is, right? And he's actually, I think, like he had some notable misses, like the Atlanta game, he was extremely inaccurate. Indianapolis in week 2, he was very inaccurate. But for the most part, like he will pick you apart if he is given the opportunity. But I think what you're saying, Casey, where I agree with you is that they're just not always, often there seems to be a bit of a lack of an it factor, which is, or maybe how I would describe it. I mean, what you're saying in terms of throwing with anticipation. And so the question I have for you then, if I can, and this might be an impossible question to answer, but is this something, because this to me, it feels more like a mental issue rather than a physical issue. Like it isn't an issue with the strength of his arm or his ability to place the ball. But how do you, for someone like Cousins, who's now in his 30s, has been in the league for we're pushing 10 years. I don't think he's quite 10 years, but probably 7 or 8. I mean, how does he develop this ability? Can he develop this ability to, make those throws? What are your thoughts?
I mean, at a certain point, you are what you are. And,
yes. Yeah.
Can he get better? Yeah. Like think about you in your personal life. You always feel like you can get better at your job. You can be, a better podcaster or a better, whatever your job is at school. You can be a better student. You can work and understand concepts better and how the flow of everything goes. So like, he's not just capped at this like nebulous ceiling where he's never going to be able to throw something with anticipation. I think a lot of it has to do with working with rookie Justin Jefferson, despite how good he was. And it seemed like they had good trust. It's still understanding like, okay, he is actually going to run this correct route. I can throw this with anticipation here, and being familiar with the offensive system. Like he had Kubiak full time after Stefanski left. That's a slightly different new system. This year, he's going to have another one that's slightly new, different system. The terminology may change a little bit depending on if they, go with the quarterback's coach and promote him or get someone outside of the building. Like those things matter. And I think as fans and people watching, a lot of the times there's not a lot of leeway given. You're like, hey, you're a professional. You should understand this offense, in the first year. And that's a lot of the times not very realistic. Like there's so many things that go into running that offense, the protections, the offensive line issues, the audibles, the calls, all that terminology can change, what the concepts are. where you want to read, who you want to highlight on the play, what's the primary read based on this coverage, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So as you get more comfortable in a system and you're not, your mind isn't going a mile a minute pre-snap trying to get everything going, and you can just sort of settle in and react, that's when you start to see quarterbacks really take that next step. And Kirk Cousins hasn't had that opportunity the last couple of years. So I think there's reason for, or room for, a little bit of optimism. I don't think he's ever going to be, throwing crazy anticipation throws and running around and doing stuff like Patrick Mahomes and Russell Wilson and Aaron Rodgers. But I think there's room for him to improve with a stable system and maybe some help on the offensive line, which we may get into later. But I think he's corrected a lot of the issues. His big knock was like, he doesn't do well in primetime games, or he struggles in the fourth quarter. And this year he came out and his, by quarter, his highest quarterback rating was in the fourth quarter at 117.3. Like, that's elite level of play in the fourth quarter. So I think he's working on it. And as things stabilize a little bit at the offensive coordinator position and the system becomes more familiar, I think that'll help for sure.
Sure. I mean, what you're saying with the OC stuff, he's going into year 4 with the Vikings, and this will be his 4th offensive coordinator with the Vikings. And then I think even going back to Washington, there's a couple of years there where he was year to year with his, I think it's been like 5 or 6 years where he's had a different person, in his ear on game day telling him this stuff. And so one thing that so Sam and I have talked about this, whatever, with Fritz Shermer in his book, talking about how he says, there's an invisible string between a player's brain and their feet. And the more they have to think, the slower their feet will go. So how difficult is it? I mean, you work with quarterbacks, to have a different voice in your headset, right? And to have maybe just, even if it's the same system, even if it's Clint Kubiak gets promoted and we have the exact same system and maybe even the same vocabulary, how difficult is it for a Kirk Cousins, even as an intelligent guy, a veteran, to do that, to make that switch and to not have that continuity now for a better part of a decade? What kind of challenges does that present?
Yeah, it's not easy. I mean, I think it goes back to their relationship with each other and understanding, when I call this play, I want you looking at this thing, and I won't necessarily communicate that on the headset. Like, I got to say the play and I get like 1 or 2, seconds to say like, hey, check the free safety on this or something like that. Right. But it's understanding like, hey, based on what we talked about on the sideline last drive, the defense is adjusting this way. If I call this play, we're going to, be looking at this because of their adjustment. And as a quarterback, like, that relationship changes from coordinator to coordinator. Like, one coordinator wants you to look at this, or this is how they're going to adjust. And even in drive, if they're seeing like, we're hitting the outside zone with Dalvin Cook a ton, we're going to run this bootleg. The linebackers are flowing very, very quickly. Let's hit the over and not dump it straight to the flats, which has been open all game. And we've hit it a couple times, but now this deep over at 10 to 12 yards is going to be open. And understanding that that's what the coordinator wants you to do without necessarily communicating it in as many words. So it's they've worked together, and that might be more seamless if the Vikings decide to promote in-house. But it takes time to adjust, and every new coordinator wants to put their stamp. They have different ideas, and despite the system being similar or almost exactly the same, like the play calling cadence and the ideas of how to exploit defenses, there's minor differences that you got to sort of come to an agreement on or meet in the middle on. Sure.
I'm going to hit you with, it's a simple question in a sense, but it's probably a difficult answer. Is Kirk Cousins a franchise quarterback?
I would say yes. And
okay. Well, you just alienated half the listeners.
I think the big question is, if you don't have Kirk Cousins, who are you going to get? Like, what's the solution? Yeah. And I think a lot of fans, especially with coaches and quarterbacks, they're like, well, this guy isn't it. But you got to look and say, all right, then who is? Like, what's the solution? If you get rid of Kirk Cousins, like, do you remember Christian Ponder from a few years ago? Is that where we want to go? Like, it was a dark time for Vikings quarterbacks for a while there. And Kirk Cousins has brought them to relevancy and made them competitive basically every year he's been there. They were just in the playoffs last year and upset the Saints. They've proved that they have a nucleus there that can perform well. And unfortunately, there were a lot of injuries on defense, and I think that sort of tanked their season a little bit in some degree. But that offense has performed. Like, I don't know if you can look at Cousins and say, like, this year especially, that it was his fault. And if you're going to get rid of him, you better have a pretty good solution that's going to take his place. Because I think at this point, there's not much out there, especially where the Vikings are picking. I don't think you want to go take someone number one, especially with his contract. You might want to take someone later in the draft and sort of build someone underneath him. But as of right now, I don't see a better solution out there. And he's proven that he can win games, and he's proven that he can operate the offense. He's proven that he can throw at a high level. Is he perfect? Is he a top tier elite quarterback that's going to carry you to the Super Bowl? No, but he can take you into the playoffs. And if he has some help or he gets hot, he can take you a long ways.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What do you got, Sam?
Well, I was curious because when you said yes to franchise quarterback, then I was thinking, does that mean that you trust him to take you to the Super Bowl? And you kind of are saying not necessarily, but like I was talking to Kyle actually before this call and looking at the past quarterbacks that have won a Super Bowl, and that's a pretty elite list.
Yeah.
But I guess the thought is that is it a question of can the Vikings win with him, or like it doesn't feel like doesn't hold back on the team. You would have to have a really good team surrounding him to be able to get there.
Yeah. And I mean, I think you can count on like one hand of guys that you trust to carry you to a Super Bowl. You know, like there's not many of those guys. There's 4 or 5 maybe in the entire league. And, you know, I think people look on the outside and they see all these teams succeeding with, you know, the Packers and Aaron Rodgers and Brett Favre and Tom Brady and Patrick Mahomes. And they're like, I want that guy. Well, there's only 3 or 4 of those guys in the entire world. So it's not so easy as saying like, well, we got to go get that guy. So you find ways to, as every coach should, find ways to win with the guys that you have. If you have to scheme around them and play to their strengths, and, you know, the playbook is a little bit more limited, then that's what it is. A good coach will find a way to win. And I think Zimmer's a good enough coach to get that defense right. I mean, we've seen the Ravens do it a couple times with elite defenses that go to the Super Bowl. I mean, Peyton Manning was a shell of himself his last Super Bowl. His defense carried him a long ways. Like the 49ers didn't have an elite quarterback. Is Jimmy G, did they need to, you know, that's a question for their fan base. And I'm sure they're as divided on him as Vikings fans are on Kirk Cousins, but he took them to the Super Bowl and was a play away. They collapsed. They had the Super Bowl in their hands, and, you know, that defense was very good, but they, you know, that's sort of the formula I see with Kirk Cousins. I think he's better than Jimmy G. I think he's a little bit above that tier, but he's going to need some help, and he has the help on offense. I mean, you would like to protect them a little bit better, but if that defense is healthy, I mean, I think you can at least pencil in like 3 or 4 wins for the Vikings if Kendricks and Barr and Hunter are there. Like there were a number of 1-score games where, you know, a sack or a turnover changes the entire game, and you're sitting in the playoffs instead of the Bears. Like, you know, the Bears didn't deserve to be there. I think the Vikings were a more competitive team than the Bears, and they're not that far away.
That's fair. Maybe the final question I have for you here on Kirk Cousins. I mean, you mentioned earlier, you know, the pre-snap motion and all these things. You know, it makes me think about, you know, you think about like McVay and 11 personnel and Cooper Kupp doing his thing, you know, the motions and all this stuff. I mean, if you were Mike Zimmer calls up Casey Sully and says, you're the new OC for the Vikings, I mean, would you want to open up this offense a little bit? One of the criticisms and concerns from Vikings fans is that the offense is somewhat stale and predictable, in that the philosophy itself is sound, and, you know, and we like some of the main kind of core ideas, but that is just kind of an old version, this Gary Kubiak version, as opposed to, say, the Kyle Shanahan or the Sean McVay version. I mean, should the Vikings open this up a little bit and put more onto Kirk, put more onto his arm, rather than being so Dalvin Cook focused and that sort of thing? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I said, let's take the ball away from Dalvin Cook Mike Zimmer would fire me.
You'd be
The
done.
second I said that, I spoke
Yeah.
those treasonous words.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean, when I was watching the offense and looking at the film for the Vikings, it did feel stale, and the Vikings only ran play action 24% of the time, and
Shocking.
that's not enough when you have Dalvin Cook, and Cousins has shown he's great on the move and can roll out and throw to his left and all that stuff. So that was the biggest issue that I had from a philosophical standpoint on the offense. There were a couple times that it seemed like at least once or twice every game there would be a play where 3 receivers or 2 receivers are in the same exact spot. And I don't know if that's bad scheme or miscommunication with inexperienced receivers or what it was necessarily, but there were times where it's just like a dead play. You can cover those 3 guys with 1 defender, and what's Kirk Cousins supposed to do? So I think there's room to be more inventive, and I think that sort of speaks to a larger issue in the NFL, is sort of staying with these old hats and tried and true blue blood coaches that sort of bounce around from team to team, and there's no new concepts and new ideas, and people are scared to take a chance on someone. But we've seen it work with Shanahan. We've seen it work with McVay. LaFleur's doing it in Green Bay. Nick Sirianni was just hired in Philadelphia. Frank Reich is also young, did a good job in Indianapolis. So I think there's starting to be a trend there. I don't know if the Vikings will follow that trend, but I think there is room for the scheme to help the players more on offense for the Vikings.
Sure. Yeah, I think from my perspective and a lot of Vikings fans, you look at it and you say, okay, Kirk Cousins is playing pretty well. He has taken a step forward, it seems. And then you give him Jefferson and Thielen and Cook and Irv Smith. It just says, the offense was good, but it just felt like it could be elite and it could be really scary. And I knew that the O-line certainly left a lot to be desired, but with that collection of skill, it always kind of felt like they underachieved a little bit. Just because it seems, man, you give that group of skill to someone like Andy Reid or Sean McVay or something like that. And I know these are extreme scenarios because these are like the best offensive lines in the world, but
yeah,
it just always felt like the Vikings offense could just be just lethal and so explosive and such a nightmare for opposing defenses. So hopefully we can take that step. Sam, what do you think here? Anything on Kirk Cousins and the Vikings offense before we do third down?
Yeah, no, for me, I hear all you guys are talking about, and for when I'm watching quarterbacks, I find that my tendency is more to see how they perform in those moments that you really kind of see a make or break moment for them. And I know there was one drive we talked about this, Kyle and I, at one point. I think it was the game against the Bucks, and they were down. It looked like this game was over at half, and he came back in the third quarter and had this really significant drive that by no means was special, but it was what they needed. And I guess for me, I see Kirk Cousins as a little bit of a fighter. My introduction to him, or one of the first memories I have of him, is that moment as he's walking down the tunnel with the Redskins and his thing. And for me, that seems so sometimes almost underappreciated in a quarterback. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where that's the kind of guy I want as a quarterback for my team.
Yeah, you want some fire, someone to get people going, say hey, we're down, but we need this game, especially against the Bucks. That was kind of their season at that point of this drive, we need it right now. And he brings some juice for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's good. I know you're not going to change a whole lot of people's minds, and that's okay. And it's all right. If that's your goal, no, I'm just saying, even just for us, if your goal is to try to change people's minds, it's not going to happen. But at least we can show Kirk a little love. Transitioning to the last down here, we wanted to talk a little about the draft, and the draft's coming up in this process. You mentioned at the start there a little bit, but how different can you maybe even just capture how different this process is with scouting and preparation in a strange year where you've got some people playing some games, some people playing a full season, some people opting out. It's a crazy process.
it's kind of a disaster. It's hard to evaluate. I mean, obviously, NFL GMs have access to more information and more film than I do. There's sort of a lack of I don't know, a collected group of film for college football out there. You got to sort of search and find on YouTube, and there's nothing like the NFL Game Pass for college football film. So it can be tough to find those games that you're looking for. If someone played, 2 games and then decided to opt out or whatever, then you're kind of stuck if those aren't on YouTube. But yeah, I mean, I think the pro days will, a lot of times it feels like those are, skewed a little bit to help out their own players because it's their school. And, if you can shave a half, second off of their 40 time or something, go for it. It doesn't hurt anybody. So it'll be interesting how the scouts have to jump from place to place. And I think the reporting may be interesting on that because you only have so many scouts. You can only go to so many pro days. So if you're interested in someone, you got to show up or get a live feed or something. So that's going to change, and interviewing the prospects, seeing them face to face might not happen. Evaluating sort of what their injury status is, if they had an injury from the season. And then there's the guys that, haven't even played football in a year. And how do you evaluate them? Have they let themselves go? They're going to have their pro day, presumably, but there's probably going to be some guys like, oh, I'm out of shape. I'm not doing a pro day. Like, I'm going to ride my film from 2019, and that's who I am. And, I balled out that year. So sign me up. I'm ready to be a first round pick. And there probably will be some of those guys that flame out pretty quickly that you haven't seen in a while. So it's going to be hard to evaluate really top to bottom. I mean, there's some guys, the blue bloods that played and had a number of games. Those guys are, I don't know. You think about like Trevor Lawrence didn't need to come back. Justin Fields probably didn't need to come back, and they did. And I think that probably helped their stock in some way. It's expected of them to be a quarterback and do that. I don't think if Trevor Lawrence had not played, that Justin Fields would all of a sudden be the number 1 pick. But it's a tricky situation for the college players too. Like, do I risk coming back and getting hurt, risk myself being infected and giving it to my family or my friends? But it's going to be a challenge for the GMs too. A lot more guesswork, even more than normal. I mean, the draft is already kind of a crapshoot, so now you throw this wrinkle in there, and it's going to be tough for sure.
Yeah, and I think that like for me, seeing the Vikings pick kind of mid first round, I feel like there's almost something to be encouraged about that, where there's a chance that you have a guy, and with just the uncertainty, there's a chance you have a guy that you take at 14 that, looking back, you were like, man, like there's no way he should have been there. There's also the chance that you just absolutely whiff on the pick because you're choosing someone based on, like we think that there's a potential here, and it just doesn't end up happening. So it just feels like it's just a more of a lottery system than it normally is. You said it is a little bit of a, you just don't know how it's going to go process, but it does feel like there's almost just a higher variable in terms of this could be a really good draft, a really weak draft when the Vikings fans look back on it. But I guess for us, as we think about the draft and specifically the Vikings, have you, in watching them, like, is there any areas that you would identify as needs for the Vikings, and maybe even just some prospects that you could see lining up with those needs?
Yeah, I mean, left guard Dakota Dozier, he ain't it. I'm just gonna let you know. He had some pretty bad feet. He overset a number of times, and I think you got to have a replacement for him. Philosophically, I don't know how the Vikings will approach that. I know a lot of teams they feel like they want to go take a tackle that played tackle in college and convert those guys to guard because they tend to be more athletic. So it's kind of rare to take a true guard, especially in the first round. But I think if Wyatt Davis is there from OSU, I think he'd be a pretty good fit. He plays with good strength and mobility. He can fit a zone scheme. I mean, he may be a little bit top heavy at 315 pounds, and he can struggle sort of with that balance a little bit. But he's a true guard. He would slot in there probably day one. That'd be pretty easy. it's just whether you would rather take a true guard or take a tackle that might be able to bump around the line. I know Zimmer sort of likes to get the best 5 out there. So a guy with versatility that can also play tackle might be more attractive to them, and sort of getting somebody like Rashawn Slater from Northwestern or Alex Leatherwood from Alabama, Christian Darrisaw from Virginia Tech. Those guys might be sort of on their radar as well. And, if Dozier somehow pulls it together and is serviceable there, maybe you can bump those guys out to tackle as a long-term plan for Riley Reef, or, I know Ezra Cleveland was playing a little bit out of position at right guard, but, getting that versatility, I think, is very attractive from my viewpoint. I don't know if that's necessarily what the Vikings will end up doing, but on the offensive side of the ball, that's where my eyes are.
What do you have for defense? I want to ask a little bit more about the O-line, but what do you have when you think of the defense? Are there any ideas for particular areas of need, and then, prospects who might, be able to address some of those needs?
Yeah. I think you need someone across from Danielle Hunter that would help the most. Obviously, just having him back will help a lot. Having Kendricks back and the linebackers back also will make a world of difference, because especially in Zimmer's defense at the linebacker position, he likes those double A gap blitzes and looks and moving those linebackers around. He trusts them to be athletic. And the issue is, once you lose those guys and you have backups that maybe aren't as athletic, it's puts a strain on that defensive structure. Because if you're going to show those A-gap blitzes and walk people up, you got to be athletic enough to get out and get to your coverage spot. And a lot of the times the linebackers, the Vikings, weren't, because they're not Michael Kendricks and Anthony Barr. So I think those things will help, but you still need somebody at edge. Adenigbo is going to be a restricted free agent. He may or may not be back. A little up and down, not fantastic in 2020. But Kwity Paye may be a good edge rusher there at 14. It's sort of hard to tell where he'll end up. He has some good athleticism. He's pretty strong, makes some nice splash plays, but he can be a little unpolished. So he may not be like an every down start as a third down rusher kind of guy. But I think he has a lot of potential. And then you sort of have Gregory Rousseau, who's the flip side of that, who's a little bit more consistent. He has a lot of experience, but he's maybe a little less athletic than Kwity Paye is. You can also, if you dip into the third or second round, it's, then things sort of go haywire as far as predicting who's going to be there. But Jalen Twyman out of Pitt might be around in the second round. I know the Vikings don't have a second round pick, but if you combine those threes and trade up or something, that might be an option. He opted out, so he's one of those guys that are going to be hard to determine what's going on with him, but he's super athletic. He's out of Pitt, good pass rusher. And those are the edge guys I would look at most in the first round. And then if you want defensive tackle, I know Michael Pierce was out and he'll help, but solidifying the interior defense will help the linebackers if, down the road you need to replace one of those guys that are starting to age a little bit. Keeping those linebackers clean, letting Barr and run around and make those plays and stay clean and not have to shed blocks and stuff would also be helpful.
Fair enough. Yeah. Losing Barr and Kendricks was just so impactful. And then Pierce and Hunter. Have you, you were just talking about D-line and D-tackle. I saw there's a clip circulating on Twitter today of Kwity Paye. I don't know if I've pronounced that gentleman's name correctly or not, but it's him, and he's in like a weighted vest with a 200-pound kettlebell doing a single leg squat. It's just like otherworldly. And so you're thinking, man, I want this kid on my team. Like this is an impressive, strong guy. And so who knows? It might be him. But I was going to ask what you thought about. You're saying D tackle. Have you had a chance? What are your thoughts on Christian Barmore, the D tackle for Bama? Is he worth a pick at 14? Or even if you were to trade down a handful of picks, of course, Spielman loves to trade down. Have you been able to form an opinion on Barmore and his ability and whether he'd be worth a first round pick?
Yeah, I haven't done a deep dive on him, but I've seen
Yep.
bits and pieces.
Yep.
Just on the topic of trading down, this might be a good draft for it because people,
Yeah.
will believe, oh, we found the diamond in the rough that nobody's seeing. I can't believe he dropped to 14. Let's go get him right now. And we're willing to give up something because we don't want this guy to get snatched up. And he's somebody that we believe in that, played 2 years ago and nobody has seen. Maybe had an injury in 2019 and had a really good sophomore season or something in 2018, and we want to go get him. Is he worth the pick at 14, though? I'm not completely sold. He has some good flashes, and he can hold up in the run game and has some athleticism. But, is that the biggest need, or do you trust your linebackers? Like, hey, defensive tackle in the first round is not the priority this year. Let's get an edge guy and get some depth maybe in the third or fourth round and get a defensive tackle that can hold up there, because we believe that Michael Pierce being back and our linebackers coming back, that's not going to be as big of a hole and an issue as it was this year.
Fair enough. Yeah, it's interesting. I just don't know where the Vikings, they haven't picked. So they picked one defensive lineman in the first round in the past 10 years, and it was Sharif Floyd, D tackle, whose career was ended because of an injury. Otherwise, the highest defensive end they've picked in the past 10 years was at 72. They just don't do it. And it's so, but I hear what you're saying about Quaddy Pay and then Russo, with Hunter, and you think to yourself, this is the year, especially after their pass rush was just so awful. And so you think you partner one of these kids with Hunter, and it just seems to make a ton of sense. But Rick Spielman hasn't called me yet to hear my opinion.
How dare he? He's got to get on it.
Yeah, apparently. So, but if you're talking to him, Casey, maybe please share your perspective.
I'll plug you. I'll let
I appreciate that.
Kyle has something for you.
Yeah, exactly. The question I wanted to ask you, because you're talking about, you're exactly right when you say Zimmer wants to play his best five at offensive line, and he hasn't been shy about moving guys around either. You know what I mean? Taking a rookie left tackle and putting him in a right guard, and frig, man, good luck against Grady Jarrett. That's your first game in the NFL. So that's a tough ask. And so you go to the left side or the right side, your footwork changes. But even just moving a left tackle to left guard, what changes in your technique to do that? What kind of transition does a player go through? What kind of difficulties arise with that kind of thing?
Yeah, it can be challenging both directions. You think about tackles, and they're generally on the island. They don't get a ton of help. They got to be more athletic, get out on, whatever type of pass rusher they're dealing with. They generally have less work with double teams and help on the inside. Ideally, your guard is there to protect your inside if in a pass rush situation, if they don't have anyone to block. But so you need guys with length there. You don't want to have a guy with short arms generally, because if they can get their arms in on you and you're, think of a little kid, you hold their head and they're waving their arms and they can't get to you. That's sort of what it is. If you have length and you can extend one arm and keep their hands off you, that's a problem if you're a tackle. As far as guard goes, you can have a little bit less good of an athlete and have guys that have some deficiencies in one area or another. And those guys have to be a little bit smarter. They have to be able to double team and work in conjunction with the center, work double teams, especially in a zone scheme. You got to be able to work double teams and understand the flow and have relatively quick feet to be able to hook and climb to linebackers and get on guys. So things definitely change just sort of in your mindset and your responsibilities. It's in wide zone and outside zone for tackles, you're not necessarily expected to be able to hook somebody. A lot of the times those outside zone schemes hit inside. It's very rarely, maybe once a game, you end up getting outside if someone spikes in and doesn't fill outside or something, and you're able to get it to the outside. But most of the time they come underneath the guard and the tackle and are more interior. And if you're at guard, you are expected to be able to hook a defensive tackle. Because if it washes all the way down the line, sometimes those cutbacks, Dalvin Cook's pretty talented and he makes it work, but it can be challenging to sustain those blocks if you're drive blocking and not sealing anybody. the defense doesn't have to flow as hard, and the linebackers can sort of sit, and then those cutback lanes don't open up as much. So there's some challenges. There's different issues both sides, and ideally you want a guy that can play both, and generally that's what tackles are. It's easier to go from tackle to guard, I think, than guard to tackle.
Right. Yeah, that seems to make some sense. Yeah. Okay. So maybe if I could put it to you this way here, to step back and look at the draft kind of overall. So you're sitting at 14, and let's say, Rick Spielman does have you on speed dial as opposed to me. And, is there a player, a high-end player, top 10 player who Casey is really excited about, and this guy starts falling inexplicably, and we're now getting into the late, we're getting close to 10 or maybe the early double digits. Is there a player that you would say, okay, we need to make a move now to hop up 2, 3, 4 picks to go get this guy, who would just be an absolute slam dunk for the Vikings?
Yeah, I think the easiest would be Penei Sewell from Oregon.
Sure.
I can't imagine he would end up sliding, but he's clearly the top prospect for me on the offensive line, and I think he would have that versatility if you wanted him to play guard or tackle or wherever. He's a pretty good athlete. He's got good strength. He has good tape. I think he's the guy that you would have to go get. I don't know if he'll slide to be within reach, but he's sort of the slam dunk on the offensive line, I think, for this draft.
Fair enough. Would you be at all tempted if one of those high-end receivers, the Devontae Smith, Jamar Chase, would you be at all tempted to pull the trigger there and then just try and form just some sort of crazy trio of receivers, or would that just be foolish given that it's already such a strength for the Vikings?
That's a good question. I think I might be more tempted to look at Kyle Pitts, the tight end out of Florida. I know Irv Smith had some flashes, but Rudolph seems to be sort of on the way out, a little bit uninspired this year. But especially with a team that wants to be able to run the ball, I mean, Kyle Pitts can block pretty well. He's pretty dynamic in the passing game. He runs routes like a receiver. He reminds me a little bit of Jefferson in the way he runs route and understands how to attack defenses and can sort of layer his routes and attack leverage and sell vertical stems and give head nods at the top of routes and manipulate underneath coverage. I think he's really good at that. And adding a second tight end to the mix with Thielen and Jefferson could make that offense really dynamic. You'd see more 2 tight end sets. There's a lot of versatility you could do. You can have him be a move tight end. He can be a big slot outside. That would be a little bit more exciting for me. If Devontae Smith was there, I think someone would come call in and say like, hey, we're going to give you 2 firsts. And if I was the Vikings, I would probably take that. Because I mean, another receiver would be nice too. I, as an offensive guy and a quarterback and a receivers coach, like I would love to, but I don't think it's the highest. I think being prudent, I would say trade that pick away and let someone break the bank to go get him.
Sure. Yeah. Fair enough. Sam, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I was saying to Kyle, I said, like, I feel like there's 3 options here with the Vikings. Either they trade back and recoup some picks here. You make the pick based on need. So maybe that's on the edge or the offensive line or some other spot. Or you make the more, I would say, like a sexy pick where you pick one of these offensive weapons that are there. And I think it's always fascinating. And I was saying to Kyle, like, here we are. We've been reading on different draft boards, different mock drafts, and it's easy to get really hyped up about certain guys and get excited. And then draft may be like, oh man, I just can't believe that this franchise who's been doing hours and hours of scouting didn't take the player that I've been reading about for 5 minutes.
Exactly. Yeah.
And get really disappointed. But it sounds like from what you're saying that there's some obvious needs here, and unless there's a real guy there that you really believe in, the Pitts is an interesting one, but it does feel like the Vikings have some pretty clear needs that could be addressed in the draft, especially with so many skilled players at the top. There's some guys that could fall out of some serious skill.
Yeah, I agree, and I think Zimmer wants to win in the trenches, and I think that's where things are lacking right now. And if you're building to the identity of your head coach, and you want to be a physical team that plays great defense and runs the ball really well, which is I think what Zimmer wants. That's his sort of wet dream. That's the way to go. I think that's sort of what the direction seems to be for the Vikings, depending on who's there.
Fair enough. Yeah, I mean, Zimmer might beat you up if you heard you saying that, but you're probably not too far off. He's a pretty crusty guy sometimes.
He is. I don't know if he would use those words. There might be some more expletives. He wants to run the blank ball and knock the blank out of people. But I
don't know if you remember the year, if you read this, but this was back in Daniil Hunter's rookie season. But there was some sort of exchange where Hunter came in, he was relatively raw, and there's some sort of exchange where Zimmer said something to the effect of, if he doesn't start using his arms better to get better separation, that kind of thing, that he was going to rip them off and beat him with his own arms. So Zimmer is he's very direct with what he thinks. Sometimes I think crosses the line, but anyhow, be that as it may.
Hey, at least he knows. Message received. All right, coach.
Exactly.
Yes, coach. I'll use my arms.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. No, it was pretty clear. It made me think of the interview yesterday from the Colts, that little press release there. It doesn't feel as vicious. I don't know if you saw with the kneecaps and the
Dan Campbell.
The Lions with Dan Campbell.
Or sorry, the Lions. Why did I think I was the colors? Lions. I was thinking that was.
It was interesting.
That was a first impression. It was a first impression for sure. So,
I just can't imagine that's going to age very, very well. But
yeah, that clip is going to be played back as soon as the Lions get blown out in week 1.
Oh yeah. In about it's going to be silly after a couple weeks, and then after about 2 years when they've collectively won 7 games, it's going to be a mess. It's going to be a mess.
Yeah, it won't age well.
Yeah, I had a hard time watching. I honestly, it was 27 seconds, I think, and it was one of those things where I was really intrigued, but at some point I almost couldn't make it through. Anyways, I think it's off track there, but it's we're excited about this draft and excited about what can happen and hoping that whoever takes, I just feel like there's probably going to be a case where they take someone that's a little bit that can really undercover help some of these weaknesses that the team has.
Yeah, I think you're at a good spot where you're going to get somebody that can contribute pretty quickly at 14. There seems to be enough depth on either side of the trenches where you're going to get somebody that you really like, and that's encouraging if you're a Vikings fan, because both of those sides of the ball need a little bit of infusion of youth and talent, and there should be somebody there for the Vikings to pick up that they feel pretty happy with.
Can I ask you one more question about the draft here?
Shoot.
All right. So you always hear, everyone says this, but you kind of say, come on. There's always the whole, do you draft need over value kind of thing? And Spielman, of course, will always say that you draft the best player available, no matter what the position, so on and so forth. I think in a perfect world, you marry the two. It just so happens that the best player available is someone who fits an area of need, and you get that value and need in one person. It's amazing. Mm-hmm. But is this actually a thing, do you think, or are teams actually drafting for need? And what are the Vikings? What should they be doing here in terms of need versus value?
Yeah, I think the way that I would look at it is considering players in tiers, because it's very hard to sort of compare transitionally. How do you compare a receiver to an offensive lineman or a defensive tackle? How do you determine which one's better? It's very nebulous and hard. So I think a lot of times people will put guys in tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4, and then within those tiers you can select based on need. So if there's a tier 1 guy at 14 and that's your last tier 1 guy, then you may select best player available. He's the last blue chip guy that we believe in. He's our guy. With sort of maybe what the Packers did with Jordan Love. Maybe he was the last tier 1 guy on their list. everyone else was in tier 2 and they didn't feel like it was worth it at that pick. Once you're into the, everyone's in that same tier, then I think you can pick and choose what position you need most is how I would generally think about it. And I think how most GMs would probably approach it.
Fair enough. That's quite reasonable. And I think there's probably some teams that don't.
I'm sure.
Possibly the Jets, I'm sure, maybe, or something. But that seems like a very reasonable approach. Thank you for that.
For sure.
Well, that makes a lot of sense because I think that the draft, especially because you got different teams who've got different schemes and they draft based on needs. It's the whole process of tiers makes a lot of sense to me to help sort that through because it is hard, I think, sometimes to compare a quarterback versus an offensive tackle and understanding like how do you determine the value of those two. So that's helpful for me to hear. Well, I think that's all we got. We just want to thank you profusely for coming on. It's been really good to chat and taking the time out of your day to listen or to talk. So we want to point listeners towards your site, weeklyspiral.com, and you guys got a Twitter account also at Weekly Spiral. Is there anything else that you want to plug or promote?
If you want to see the YouTube breakdowns, you can go to youtube.com/Weekly Spiral for seeing the live clips and narrate over it with diagrams and stuff. That's where that's at. Otherwise, you got it covered. weeklyspiral.com. You can find sort of everything from weeklyspiral.com if you want to find the YouTube or the Twitter or the Instagram or whatever. That's the main hub.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Casey.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you guys.
Well, we wanted to thank Casey again for coming on. It was really just a fantastic conversation, a lot of fun to have him, and I hope that listeners enjoyed it too. That was a great conversation.
Yeah, I mean, folks should definitely obviously we appreciate you listening here and all that, but definitely check out weeklyspiral.com, especially I think as we get into the off season here. I mean, some of their draft coverage stuff is really neat. And I mean, you'll just understand football better and understand the prospects better. And so I think it's worth your time. Give it a shot. Yeah,
it feels like a good one-stop shop place for people that are looking for football coverage. And so that's great. We wanted to touch base a little bit. We didn't talk about our playoff predictions after we made them. We had Brian on a couple of weeks ago and never circled back. And the only reason I'm circling back is because I think I come out of this looking a little better than Kyle. I had the Chiefs and the Bucks representing in the finals and the Super Bowl, and Kyle, you had Chiefs, but I think you had the Seahawks.
I did, and I guess they let me down pretty spectacularly, I suppose. So at this point, my only real hope, in a sense, is, which I can't believe I'm saying this, but I actually kind of hope Sam is right about the Bucks because, my dear, just seeing the Packers in the Super Bowl will be sickening. So hopefully Sam's right.
It's easy to look at this and I'm like, I don't feel super confident, but at this point I made my pick and I'm rolling with it. There's no way I'm steering away. I think regardless of who makes it, it will be fun to see who's there. I would love to see the Bucks there. I definitely don't hate the Packers. It'd be fun to see them do that, but I know I won't talk about any success for the Packers on a Vikings podcast. It'd be interesting to see if Mahomes and what he's looking like with that injury. And the Bills, that would be a lot of fun. And I actually feel like these were the four teams. I know I didn't have to pick them. We only picked one team, but I feel like these were the four teams that I kind of thought were going to be there. So I don't know. I feel
that's what he says now.
I'm batting 100%, and I think that this may be a career.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. That you can send me all your betting guesses and stuff later. I promise. I can't promise that I will respond, but if I have a real good feeling like I did with this, then I'm gonna take it. So I'm going 0 for 100 now moving forward.
That's true.
Circling back, our hockey coverage of Minnesota Wild, man, this has been a fun start to the season. And I was telling Kyle, like I'm not just saying this because we're here, but the Minnesota Wild have been one of, if not the most talked about team as the season started. They're in second place. They're 3-1, and I said a few weeks ago, like they could start out hot, and that's going to carry them through the season. Because man, like 56 games, I know it's a ton considering when you think about football, but 56 games is really not a whole lot of time for these NFL or for these NHL teams when they're used to an 82 game schedule. And the Minnesota Wild have traditionally been a really boring team to watch. Like I think that Minnesota Wild fans say that they're boring to watch. Like there's no secret. But with Kaprasov or Kaprizov, I've heard multiple people pronounce either way. This is a fun team.
I think Wild fans should be feeling hopeful, even though you kind of need to have that hope. You open yourself up to get hurt a little bit. But Kaprizov's played well and given the team a spark for sure. And so it's exciting, I think, for the Wilds. Now, the question I have for Sam, because we look at the weakness of Minnesota and we could say they could certainly use a little bit of help at center. I mean, should they be on the phone talking to Columbus about Dubois? And if so, I mean, what would be fair compensation? How often this is like getting a franchise QB in a sense. Like in the NHL, you just don't get 22-year-olds centers become available. It just barely ever happens. And so, Sam, this is kind of a unique opportunity. Should the Wilds make their move here?
Yeah, that's a difficult question for multiple reasons. I like Dubois, for people who don't know, he signed a recent deal with Columbus for 2 years, 10 million, so 5 million a year. And this guy has been good. He's a third overall pick. At one point he was that pick was criticized for them taking him at 3 when there was another guy on the board. And so far it's really worked out. Dubois would probably be in that 20 to 25 range in terms of centerman on a ranking. So like top 20, 25 there, which for 31 teams is a first line center. And so he's at the lower end of that, but he is a very good center and has a lot of abilities to do, I think what would fit well with the Minnesota Wild in terms of he can provide some offense, but he's also got some responsibilities on defense, although it depends on who you're asking. If you're asking his coach Tortorella or not. This situation has really not been good in Columbus, and last night he played less than 4 minutes in a 60-minute game and was benched and didn't play either the second or third period or overtime. I don't know if it's like, I think you obviously you got to take risks, and this is a real buy low potential on this guy, but I do feel like they're going to be asking for a lot, and I wouldn't say that you really want to give up a couple top guys. Like obviously there's a couple guys that you would probably put as untouchables there with Kaprizov and Rossi. And then if you're asking about someone like a Boldy, like, I don't know, do you make that move? I'm going to say no. It all depends on what's the asking price. Yeah. Because they do have some guys, and like maybe Kuznetsov from the World Juniors is someone that they're looking at and targeting, and maybe you're like, hey, you know what, this might be a time to sell high on a guy that's just come off a good World Juniors performance. So I feel like if they're going for it, they're going to want one of those top guys. And I think that there's a few, you kind of move down the list and you're like, okay, probably not. And then, once you get to Boldy, Kuznetsov, depending on what they're asking outside of that picks, it doesn't feel like the Minnesota Wild, it's difficult because their D are there. I'm going back and forth here. But their D are old. They've got young guys coming on forward, and so you really have to decide what the direction of the team is, and almost similar to the Vikings in terms of you got young guys there, you got old guys there, and so maybe it's something you wait and take a few more weeks and see what happens and see how the situation evolves. So that's my real long answer of maybe, but not. I'm not overly impressed with a guy who already has issues with a team at 22 years old. It
is tough to know, though. Like, it just seems like there's we're only getting the tip of the iceberg. It
Yes.
seems like there certainly is a fair amount that has gone on behind the scenes, and I don't know who is to blame, or like you say, like you have concerns where you have this kid who's really talented and it just hasn't worked out, and so there's concern there. But like if you go to every NFL team and say, hey, do you want a young stud at defensive end? Every single NFL team says, yes, please. I'm interested in adding that person. And it's the same thing in hockey. Hey, do you want a young stud at center? Every single team says, yes, please. Absolutely. What does it take to get that player? And so, I mean, with what Sam was saying, even if it's a low end tier 1 center, it's still a tier 1 center. Someone who's going to make that top 6 go, who would fill a real need and be able to grow with that young core. So to me, that would be exciting for the Wild, but I hear what Sam's saying. There is concern, and you could definitely see a scenario where it doesn't work out.
For sure. And I'm not a risk taker by nature. And so for me, I'm looking at it and it's like, what are you going to have to give up to get a player like him? If you've got him and Rossi down the middle for the next decade, like you absolutely are not complaining about that. So I would say, I guess the answer is yes, depending on the deal. And yeah, it sounds like there's issues with the coach and with Tortorella, who is no surprise. Like it's not like shocker. Tortorella is causing issues. I've heard other things that just in the free agency period as a restricted free agent, he just started to see some teams that were interested and thought, hey, you know what, maybe Columbus isn't the best place for me long term, and that's totally fair. So it is a fascinating thing. I do wonder from Minnesota Wild fans' perspective what they would be willing to give up to get a player, because he is very good, and to be able to get a young guy, like you said, it's not like you're trading for a 27, 28-year-old center who you've got another few years left with. Like this is a guy who theoretically could be there for and an impact player for 12 years.
Yeah, it's huge.
Absolutely. So we'll transition here to Kyle's words of wisdom as we finish off the episode.
Yeah, so the final word of wisdom here is it's coming from Exodus 18, second book of the Bible, 18 chapters in. And Moses is leading the Israelites, who were a tough group to lead at this time, from what the text would say. And so Jethro, who is Moses' father-in-law, basically comes to him and says, listen, you need to divide the responsibility here. And essentially, like, you're going to burn yourself out. Like, you need to establish leaders, build up leaders to help you manage all these issues. So appoint people, of integrity and people who are competent, and they can handle these lower level concerns. And the community will thrive as a result, and you individually will be healthier as a result. And so if I could be so bold as to maybe it's time for Mike Zimmer to divide and conquer a little bit in some of those responsibilities. Maybe it's time to think about handing off the play calling. Maybe it's time to think about elevating someone who can help with the game management more. Maybe it's because there are various areas of concern and things that need to be addressed. And so maybe we should learn here from Jethro and what Moses did, and divide and conquer style of leadership.
Yeah, I think that obviously you got to have some guy at the top, but you also want to make sure that you're dividing up and really getting people in with their good skill set, because there's no way that as good of a coach as Zimmer is, there's no way that he's going to be able to be really good at everything.
Exactly.
So that's a good point, and yeah, good tie in there. So as we want to thank everyone for listening, be sure to stop by VikingsGazette.com for great Minnesota Vikings news, commentary, and analysis. The Vikings Gazette can be found on Twitter at Vikings Gazette. We hope you all have a great week, and we will check back in with you in 2 weeks' time. Thanks so much.